Hello. Is that working? Yeah, there we go. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm conscious we're the last panel between you and lunch, so we'll try and keep it as interesting as we can. My name is Mark Foster. I am the EU Policy Lead for Crypto Council for Innovation. We're a global trade association representing some of the bigger players throughout the tech stack. But I won't bore you with that. You can find out more details on the website or come and talk to me later on. I'm delighted to have an all-female panel today. So we got a bad slot in terms of the timing, but it's really nice to have that expertise here. I'm going to let the ladies introduce themselves and their organizations, and then we're going to try and answer the question, talk a little bit about policy and a little bit about politics. So from my left, Anne, over to you first, please.
Hi, good to meet everybody. My name is Anne Termine. I'm head of policy and other legal matters at Yuga Labs. For those who aren't familiar, Yuga Labs is responsible for the Bored Ape Yacht Club and the Other Side Metaverse.
Hi, I'm Josh Klayman. I am at Linklaters, which is a global law firm. I am U.S. head of FinTech and head of blockchain and digital assets, and I'm one of our global tech sector co-heads.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marina, and I'm leading the European Crypto Initiative. It's a blockchain association based in Brussels, and we're basically discussing all blockchain and crypto-related topics with regulators.
Excellent. So let's go straight to the question. And maybe we'll start with Marina first, just to give a kind of external perspective. So we're talking about the US. Obviously, there's been a lot of legislative developments and also changes in terms of outset with the regulators in the US. But seen from a European perspective, perhaps first, what's your take in terms of the question, will the US be a dominant player in the global crypto hub? And then we'll come to our US-based colleagues. Marina.
Very easy answer, for sure. I think it's important to look into this from, in a way, historical perspective, and of course, looking into the future. I would say that it depends. We have not a very clear answers. As lawyers, we usually always respond as it depends. But I see that there is a huge difference in the US right now from what we have seen in the past. As you all know, there was mostly enforcement rather than regulation for the last few years. And right now we have seen the Genius Act and going into the Market Infrastructure Act discussions. So regulation is here and it is coming. We have not seen that much enforcement, but I know that my colleagues will talk more about that. I think mostly when it comes to enforcement, it's really coming from, in a way, private, maybe class action lawsuits. But to me, what was really one of the most interesting parts was looking into how the crypto ecosystem, I would say, is just revived. There's so many ideas, so many new projects, so many new things happening, and it's really one of the most active industries right now. Compared to the EU, we have not had enforcement. We had regulation. We do have regulation right now. What's happening is that we might have enforcement in the future, maybe in a year, 2 years, etc. But right now, everyone is really focusing on understanding MiCA, on understanding how MiCA will be implemented with different, I would say, crypto as a service providers, as well as issuers. Stablecoins are a huge discussion right now. It's a really important topic in the EU, mostly in Brussels as well, but with national competent authorities. And I'll just take a moment to maybe explain a little bit what's going on there. The discussion we have right now is really based on a Q&A, which is an instrument that different authorities can ask to the European Commission when they have a question regarding the interpretation of MiCA. And in this case, the question was really, what happens with multi-issuance when it comes to a company issuing the same token in different jurisdictions? And in this case, we did not get an answer for this specific Q&A yet. There's been a long process of discussions within different institutions, and we do really expect this I would say clarity to come quite quickly, also because some of the stablecoin issuers have been in a way stopped for some, I would say, months. There's been delays in new announcements of issuing stablecoins. And together with other associations as well, we have just published a letter and discussing this letter with other institutions, mostly with the Commission on this topic. So I would say that mostly regarding national competent authorities, we have seen a few I would say, licenses given. I think it's around 68 of them right now for crypto as a service providers. But big question when it comes to stablecoins. So we need a little bit more clarity there.
Excellent, thanks, Marina. So that's a depends, maybe. The US moving forward and progressing a little bit, but the EU obviously having started earlier. We'll see what that means in terms of the global outlook. So 3 lawyers, maybe 3 different answers. Let's see. Josh, what's your perspective in terms of where the US is currently and whether it can be a global crypto hub?
Sure, so I'll keep my answer pretty short just because I know we're going to delve into the US in greater detail in a couple minutes. This is my 12th time speaking at this event. I spoke at all 12s, and it's the first time that I can say in my heart the US is open for business for crypto. Everything isn't perfectly clear. There's still a lot of ambiguity and things that need to be figured out. But if you've seen me speak at any of the prior 11 of these, you heard me talk about caution and consider not entering the US. I think now is the time. So not legal advice, not investment advice.
Excellent, thanks, Josh. That's a clear yes. We can dig a bit deeper into that going forward. And from your perspectives, where do you think the US is in its kind of trajectory on this thinking, and how that affects your business as well, of course?
So I don't want to say it depends. I'd rather say I hope it's a vehicle for innovation, as Josh said, because now there is an opportunity to really develop without fear. You know, when you work at a company like Yuga Labs and they come up with an idea and the first thought is, should we check with legal first? That's not innovation, is it? So my hope is that if and when the US can get its act together and get a bill passed, that we can accelerate the world's adoption of crypto. Because if crypto is really to be what it's supposed to be, it's egalitarian, isn't it? It's not supposed to be dominated in any one country. It's supposed to break down the borders. So maybe if the US can come online with this regulation, maybe we'll actually achieve that vision of crypto.
Excellent, yeah, and of course we had the stablecoin bill through Genius Act, but obviously we're still waiting for the market structure piece, which is a big one. In Europe, of course, we kind of did the two together in one sense, but maybe just like unpacking a little bit more about the policy kind of environment. And do you want to say either Anne or Josh a little bit about that dynamic in terms of stablecoin legislation now in place? We touched upon already the mindset change a little bit in the regulators, which has obviously come from a political signal. How do you see that moving forward and developing as we move into the next phase of legislation? So still talking about policy, and then maybe over to Marina for a reaction to that in terms of what's happening in Europe and how Europe might be relating to some of those developments. So I don't know whether Josh and
Sure. So I think what's really interesting is that if you look at, for example, just holding aside others, but you just look at the current chair of the SEC, Paul Atkins, and the prior chair of the SEC, Gary Gensler. Gary Gensler went to Congress and said, I have all the tools I need to enforce. It's perfectly clear. None of this is legal, right? And I don't need additional authorization. I have it, right? We don't need new laws. And then we hear Paul Atkins, who is pretty much in the vacuum of Congress getting a market structure bill passed, although a lot of work has been done and continues to be done to advance one, who says, actually, look, we have the authority we need to actually accommodate this technology, right, with the project crypto and things like that. So I think it's been a real mindset shift, not just, with the president coming out very strongly, even on the campaign trail, and then really delivering on his vision of making the U.S. the crypto capital of the planet, but also then the regulators following suit. I would just say one thing about the Genius Act, just in case people aren't aware. Genius is law, right? But it hasn't become effective, right? It still needs its implementing regulations and rules, and Treasury has promulgated some proposed rules for public comment and things like that. But we're still a ways away from it actually going into effect. That being said, I think just the fact that the U.S. got something passed, anything passed, is amazing. So maybe I'll pause there.
That's great. And Josh, we were talking earlier as well, you might want to just carry on the point about the legacy impact of the previous regime in terms of enforcement as well, because obviously there's been a mindset change and a political change vis-a-vis the regulators, but there's still obviously some hangover from the previous regime as well. Maybe just close that point off and then we'll move to Anne for thoughts as well.
Sure. So Okay, so is it all rosy all the time? Maybe not, right? We still have a lot to figure out. One of the things that is a bit challenging in the absence of the market structure legislation is that we don't actually have new law. Now, you may say, well, the regulators have gotten comfortable with this. It's great. We're not going to see, or we don't expect to see large-scale enforcement if there isn't fraud or actual crime, right? Like that's still hopefully going to be enforced. But what we do have is a situation where the regulators may be comfortable at the federal level. However, we have some law on the books from some cases that were brought in the previous administration, and it's still law. So the library case still exists, right, which says that the library token was a security, right? We still have Ripple, which kind of split the baby, right, with portions of it saying there were sales of securities and other portions saying, nope, no securities there. So even though we're now more comfortable generally with the idea that the token itself, unless it is a traditional, intentional, tokenized security, that the digital asset itself is just code and that, the transaction needs to be looked at from the Howey test, we still have the Howey test. We still have the Reeves test. And so while and Marina touched upon this a little bit, while the federal government might not be enforcing, private plaintiffs still may be bringing actions based on the law that's there. So that's why it is important that we get a change in law, because otherwise, there's only so much teeth that changes of regulators have. However, that's a huge piece. The last thing I would just say on this quickly is that the states, they can do their own thing. And, there are very strong feelings both ways about the current administration in the U.S., and some states, they feel very differently. They have different views on crypto. That being said, some states have long been pro-crypto, including Wyoming, where I'll be heading tomorrow. And I think it's interesting as the U.S. goes back and forth at the federal level, hopefully not back again the other way, that some states have been towing the line for crypto for a long time.
And we were talking earlier about innovation as a broader concept rather than just financial legislation and financial regulation. You obviously have background as a former public sector person as well. To what extent, in terms of that dichotomy between financial legislation, financial regulation versus innovation, how do you see that in your business and your day-to-day work with Yuga Labs?
So at Yuga, we're just focused on getting work done, right? We want to build, and we want to build as freely as possible. I will say that I'm a little bit biased on how the U.S. approaches things because I am a former regulator. I was at the CFTC for 13 years, and I was in private practice advising clients as well. And it's now at Yuga, when I go to the Hill and try to explain to senators and representatives what it is we do, they're like, you have a monkey JPEG. I'm like, it's more than that. So that's the hardest thing, is to get people to take off of their face whatever lens they look at crypto. Like if you look at the crypto through a financial lens, you're only going to see it in one way. If you look at it from the perspective of the CFTC, then you're only going to see commodities and derivatives everywhere. And all I want people to do is to recognize the variety of things that we're doing. Yes, you could say that I have monkey JPEGs and that's all Yuga is. Then you're completely missing the point of my company. And you're completely missing everything that we're doing and building and innovating. When you look at ApeCoin, our token for our community, that became ApeChain, our own blockchain, that to accelerate what we're doing there. And then other side, and what other side could mean for Web3. Try to explain that to senators who are just interested in, like, do my farmers have enough money to make it through the month? That's our issue. And if we can make this easier for senators and representatives to understand so we can get to a bill, then we might actually get to the mass adoption that crypto needs to accelerate to the next level.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because we often forget sometimes in our little bubble that there's a bigger world out there, there's bigger things going on in terms of legislation and laws. So Marina, from your perspective, in terms of Europe, obviously first mover, now seeing the US developing with an ambition to kind of maybe be a little lighter touch, a bit more innovation friendly. What's your take in terms of this dynamic between financial rules and legislation and then broader innovation? We have obviously MiCA, there's a DLT pilot project, there's also a lot of work in Europe on the EIDAS and things like that. How do you see it?
So one interesting thing that you mentioned is really tokenization. This is something that everyone in Brussels is talking about and pretty excited about as well. But not even tokenization. I would say that we go back to the basics, to understanding what MiCA actually means and what it brings to the industry. I think besides having like regulation, having a ton of guidance and regulatory technical standards coming from the European Security Market Authority, European Banking Authority, we still don't have a lot of clarity even on the basics in terms of understanding, for example, what is the difference between a crypto asset and a financial instrument. Right now, the European Banking Authority, European Securities Market Authority publish their own annual reports or annual planning for what they're going to do next year. So if you're bored, you can take that in the evening and start reading it. It's kind of predicting the future. So looking into what will happen in the next year. And ESMA said that they will write additional guidance to make sure that the industry understand what a crypto asset is versus a financial instrument. And that is really the most important thing. As you know, financial instruments might differ in different member states, and this is where really the catch is. Another thing is, again, as you mentioned, stable coins, other questions, but you have also probably heard in the news that different national competent authorities are now having different opinions on potential supervision, especially on centralized supervision for mostly bigger CASPs, so significant CASPs. Some do agree with that. For example, the French authority, some disagree, the Maltese authority. So we have a lot of, I would say, so-called drama still. We have a regulation, everything is set in place, there's been licenses given, but not everything is going perfectly smoothly. And in a way, I would say it was expected. You would agree, Mark. I think also because it is much bigger than only crypto assets. I think right now the European Union is really working on the Savings and Investment Union, and this is just part of it. So thinking about how to implement a structure where the European Union could be seen as a in a way, unified financial market as well for everyone to enter, but also to offer services to.
Thanks, Marina. I don't know whether any reactions to that. I mean, one thing that I'd like to just touch upon in terms of the policy, and then we can move to the kind of politics perhaps more for the final part of the conversation. We talk a lot in this industry about interoperability and obviously international standard setting bodies, a key part of trying to make this global market work. I don't know whether any of you have views about, again, the different jurisdictions that are going in slightly different directions, slightly different speeds. Again, this US administration's view in terms of how it wants to be a crypto hub versus what that means for international standard setting bodies. I can see Anne from your...
Yeah, I can take that one quickly. My biggest concern is definitions. Because crypto is constantly innovating, as soon as you try to put a definition on one term, you've automatically limited that term. And that is when I speak to regulators around the world, that is my biggest concern, because when you started the definitions, that becomes your regulation, right? So if you put something into this bucket, that defines what the regulations are. So for me, where Yuga, it's really hard to define our buckets. That's where I try to get the regulators to think in a more broad fashion. I think cross-border, it's going to be difficult because of, Singapore's in one place, Hong Kong in another, the European Union in a different place, and the US is doing whatever the hell US is doing, which is nothing because we're in the middle of a shutdown, but that's a whole nother story. It'll work itself out. When you look at what happened after the financial crisis in 2008, and I was in the CFTC during this whole time, and watching the passage of Dodd-Frank and other regulations, particularly in the European Union, we managed to figure it out. We'll do it again, but it's going to be painful and probably costly for the industry along the way, which is why you should be active. You should be talking to your regulators so we could get to a much quicker place than it took after the financial crisis. At least that's my perspective.
Thanks, Anne. Any other reactions?
Yeah, so I agree with Anne about the importance of definitions. I would also say, and maybe, I don't know how popular or unpopular a view this is, but I think when we talk about harmonization across various jurisdictions, I mean, it reminds me of something from college where I took a class, I don't even remember what class, but I remember someone saying, be rational means see it my way, right? And so I think spending a lot of time on harmonization of these vastly different regimes, I think that's, at least across the jurisdictions, I wouldn't focus our efforts on that. Maybe on recognition, bilateral recognition of certain aspects, right? But trying to harmonize everything, we can't even do that across the 50 states in the U.S. In fact, like if you look at the Genius Act, right, where it has a federal path that's permitted with the OCC charter, and it also has state paths, for example, with state chartered banks like the SPDI in Wyoming, for example. Even just trying to get recognition of those, individual state charters in other states, that's a whole process. So I do think sometimes, yes, in some wonderful world, it will be plug and play. You can just, navigate freely. But I think if we focus on harmonization across jurisdictions as the goal, I don't think we're going to be able to reach that goal anytime soon.
If it's any consolation, we also have quite a bit of differentiation in Europe as well, even though we have MiCA, which is supposed to be a regulation. But Marina, I don't know whether you have views on that as well.
Yeah, maybe 2 points there. We do have a crypto assets report from IOSCO and even a DeFi report then. And I remember when we looked at it, I think they published it 2 or 3 years ago. There's no definitions there. So to your point, I think that would be quite a hard thing to do, to really have a definition of a crypto asset and all the other assets like stablecoins in a document where everyone in the world or everyone that is a member of IOSCO would agree with. So that is one. The second one, it was just published, financial FSB published something on stablecoins as well, saying, the governments are not doing enough when it comes to stablecoins. We need to supervise more. We need to regulate more. And we're getting this papers, opinions continuously, but at the end of the day, I think that the implementation of different regulations might come through equivalence, as you mentioned. Different projects are thinking right now how to be compliant in different jurisdictions. And I think that there's been discussion coming from the US thinking about equivalence regimes, same, of course, as mentioned with stablecoins in the EU. And here we will need to have this also bilateral discussions to understand if there's trust in a regulation that one jurisdiction has adopted, and then they would be in a way seen as equivalent, and also for, I would say for the industries, also easier to implement.
So still a role for the international standard setters and the importance of that kind of collaboration between regulators at global level.
May I just respond to that a little bit? And I do agree with you, Marina. I would just point for the IOSCO reports for a second. Like my friend Val Spanik at the SEC, who is my friend, right? She wrote those, right? And she's no longer focused on digital assets, right? She's heading up AI innovation at the SEC. And now we don't have a FinHub, we have a crypto task force. So it does make me think, like, yes, we have the IOSCO reports, say on DeFi, for example, which basically said, look, you can look at DeFi and apply existing law and find the various players doing the various pieces. But now the view at the US regulators is quite different. And actually, the view in Congress is quite changing as well, as we know from the leaked DeFi draft from the Senate Democrats, which caused a lot of uproar from people in the industry and also from Republicans. So I do think that it is helpful that we have those reports. I do think that some of the changes that we're seeing in the US likely will call into question how much of what was written a couple of years ago still is the view.
Yeah, that's a good reminder that policy isn't in a bubble, obviously, is impacted by the politics of the given day. Conscious we only have a few minutes left, so let's maybe try and stick to that kind of political angle. And you mentioned earlier the government shutdown in the US. Again, trying to stick to the theme a little bit. To what extent is that affecting kind of day-to-day evolution of policy in the US? And obviously you mentioned the market structure bill going forward. Just give us a sense about how you think that might develop. And then obviously Josh, we'll come to Marina to close us off maybe in terms of the EU, how we are in Europe reacting to that, and then we'll have some concluding thoughts. Thank you.
So with the shutdown, that means that in all of the agencies, there's a very skeletal staff. I worked through a shutdown. That was not fun. May or may not have a relative who's still working through a shutdown. It's still not fun. And it puts you in a really difficult situation when you're in an agency, because you're just trying to keep the doors open and trying to keep matters moving forward, but you can't really solve for anything because you need the full staff there to get things done. Same thing on the Hill, right? Not everybody, all the staffers for all the senators and legislators are working. It's a skeletal staff. So trying to get bills and trying to get conversations happening to get, the Dems back on board with backing off of their DeFi bill on the Senate side versus what the Senate Republicans have got going on, it just slows things down. And when you throw into the fact that the U.S. is going to go through a midterm election next year, by the end of this year, people are going to be focused on what do I need to tell my constituents so I can get reelected by November of 2026. So if we don't have something really substantive out of Senate comparable to what the House already has with its Clarity Act, I'm a little concerned as to whether something's actually going to pass in the U.S. before 2026. Even if it gets passed, it goes to the regulators, goes to CFTC, and then they have to implement it, which then puts it another year down the road. So if we're lucky, the U.S. will have some sort of legislation that's fully implemented, but not before 2027, which again slows down the industry. So what do? We do nothing from the regulatory point of view, from the company point of view. You got to keep working. And you just keep having conversations to make sure that you don't fall into one of those avenues that could end up being a roadblock somewhere down the road. And you cross your fingers and you hope that sanity reigns, but it's Washington. I've lived there my entire life. It never reigns. Sanity in Washington.
So there's been a lot of progress in the last 12 months, but potentially some barriers in the next 12 months going forward, both in terms of the politics and the policy. Exactly. Josh, any other points you'd like to add to that?
I would say Anne framed that really well. May I just touch upon one other separate thing? And it's something that also came up on the last panel that we were watching, which was decentralization and what its role is. Like, I realize there are some true believers in decentralization. And so I hold that aside for a moment, right? There are benefits to decentralization. For those who were doing it just to avoid the SEC or some other kind of regulator, I do think that is something that is shifting right now. As Anne mentioned, the focus on innovation rather than decentralization. And even in some informal chats, there has been a question, with key regulatory staff at the SEC about what is the importance of decentralization, and should that actually be a goal versus just having the best products, the best developments, the best building, right? But I know Marina has also heard more about that. So,
thanks, Marina. Do you want to close us out just in terms of how the EU is reacting to these developments in the US? Everyone wants to be a crypto global hub, but maybe a few thoughts from you, and then we'll let these good people get off to their lunch. So, thank you very much.
I think there is the activities and in a way the revival of the industry is a little bit contagious in the EU as well. There's a lot of interest. We see also from fintechs coming in, but as you have seen, our commission has worked also on other initiatives linked also to the previous panel, which it comes to investments, startups, innovation, mostly around the 28th regime. You have probably heard about that, really supporting innovation in Europe and investments, as well as the, in a way, European tech stack. So enforcing European companies through MiCA, of course, through crypto, but within fintech and other innovations as well.
Excellent. So lots of things to keep us busy, lots of politics, lots of policy. Please join me in thanking the panel, and then hope you all have a nice lunch.
Thank you, everybody.